Dean Arnold Corll, December 24, 1939, August 8, 1973, was an American serial killer who abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 28 teenage boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas. Corll was aided by two teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. The crimes, which became known as the Houston mass murders, came to light after Henley fatally shot Corll. Upon discovery, it was considered the worst example of serial murder in U.S. history. Corll's victims were typically lured with an offer of a party or a lift to a succession of addresses in which he resided between 1970 and 1973. They would then be restrained either by force or deception, and each was killed either by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. Corll and his accomplices buried 17 of their victims in a rented boat shed. 4 other victims were buried in woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn. 1 victim was buried on a beach in Jefferson County, and at least 6 victims were buried on a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula. Brooks and Henley confessed to assisting Corll in several abductions and murders. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment at their subsequent trials. Corll was also known as the Candy Man and the Pied Piper, because he and his family had owned and operated a candy factory in Houston Heights, and he had been known to give free candy to local children. Early life. Childhood. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the first child born to Mary Emma Robinson, May 9, 1916, May 31, 2010, and Arnold Edwin Corll, February 7, 1916, April 5, 2001. Corll's father was strict with his children, whereas his mother was markedly protective of both her sons. Their marriage was marred by frequent quarreling, and the couple divorced in 1946, 4 years after the birth of their younger son, Stanley Wayne Corll. Mary Corll subsequently sold the family home and relocated to a trailer home in Memphis, Tennessee, where Arnold Corll had been drafted into the U.S. Air Force after the divorce, in order that her sons could remain in contact with their father. Dean Corll was a shy, serious child who seldom socialized with other children, but at the same time displayed concern for the well-being of others. At the age of 7, he suffered an undiagnosed case of rheumatic fever, which was not recognized until doctors found Corll had a heart murmur in 1950. As a result of this diagnosis, Corll was ordered to avoid PE at school. Corll's parents attempted reconciliation and remarried in 1950, subsequently moving to Pasadena, Texas. However, the reconciliation was short-lived and, in 1953, the couple once again divorced, with the mother again retaining custody of her 2 sons. Their divorce was granted on amicable grounds, and both boys maintained regular contact with their father. Following the second divorce, Corll's mother married the traveling clock salesman named Jake West. The family moved to the small town of Vidor, where Corll's half-sister, Joyce, was born in 1955. Upon advice from a pecan nut salesman, Corll's mother and stepfather started a small family candy company named Pecan Prince, initially operating from the garage of their home. From the earliest days of the candy business, Corll worked day and night while still attending school. He and his younger brother were delegated the responsibility of running the candy-making machines and packing the product, which his stepfather sold on his sales route. This route often involved West traveling to Houston, where much of the product was sold. From 1954 to 1958, Corll attended Vidor High School, where he was regarded as a well-behaved student who achieved satisfactory grades. As had been the case in his childhood, Corll was also considered somewhat of a loner, although he is known to have occasionally dated girls in his teenage years. In high school, Corll's only major interest was the brass band, in which he played trombone. Moved to Houston Heights. Corll graduated from Vidor High School in the summer of 1958. Shortly thereafter, he and his family moved to the northern outskirts of Houston so that the family candy business could be closer to the city where the majority of their product was sold. Corll's family opened a new shop, which they named Pecan Prince in reference to the brand name of the family product. In 1960, at the request of his mother, Corll moved to Indiana to live with his widowed grandmother. During this period of time, Corll formed a close relationship with a local girl, although he rejected a subsequent marriage proposal she made to him in 1962. Corll lived in Indiana for almost 2 years, but returned to Houston in 1962 to help with his family's candy business, which by this date had moved to Houston Heights. He later moved into an apartment of his own above the shop. Corll's mother divorced Jake West in 1963 and opened a new candy business, which she named Corll Candy Company. Her eldest son was appointed vice president of the new family firm, with his younger brother Stanley being appointed secretary-treasurer. The same year, one of the teenage male employees of Corll Candy Company complained to Corll's mother that Corll had made sexual advances towards him. In response, Mary West fired the teenager. U.S. Army service. Corll was drafted into the United States Army on August 10, 1964, and assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for basic training. He was later assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, to train as a radio repairman before his permanent assignment to Fort Hood, Texas. According to official military records, Corll's period of service in the Army was unblemished. Corll, however, reportedly hated military service. He applied for a hardship discharge on the grounds that he was needed in his family's business. The Army granted his request and he was given an honorable discharge on June 11, 1965, after 10 months of service. Reportedly, Corll divulged to some of his close acquaintances after his release from the United States Army that it was during his period of service that he had first realized that he was homosexual, and had experienced his first homosexual encounters. Other acquaintances noted subtle changes in Corll's mannerisms when in the company of teenage males after he had completed his service in the Army and returned to Houston, which led them to believe he may have been homosexual. Corll Candy Company. Following his honorable discharge from the Army, Corll returned to Houston Heights and resumed the position he had held as vice president of his family's candy business. Corll's former stepfather had retained ownership of the family's former candy business following his mother's divorce in 1963, and competition between the two firms was fierce. As had been the case in his teenage years, Corll increased the number of hours he devoted to the candy business to satisfy an increasing public demand for his family's product. In 1965, the Corll Candy Company relocated to 22nd Street, directly across the street from Helms Elementary School. Corll was known to give free candy to local children, in particular teenage boys. As a result of this behavior, he earned himself the nicknames the Candy Man and the Pied Piper. The company employed a small workforce, and he was seen to behave flirtatiously toward several teenage male employees. Corll is known to have installed a pool table at the rear of the candy factory where employees and local youths would congregate. Friendship with David Brooks. In 1967, Corll befriended 12-year-old David Owen Brooks, then a bespectacled 6th-grade student and one of the many children to whom he gave free candy. Brooks initially became one of Corll's many youthful close companions, regularly socializing with Corll and various teenage boys who congregated at the rear of the candy company. He also joined Corll on the regular trips he took to South Texas beaches in the company of various youths, and later commented that Corll was the first adult male who did not mock his appearance. Whenever Brooks told Corll he needed cash, Corll gave him money, and the youth began to view Corll as a father figure. Upon Corll's urging, a sexual relationship gradually developed between the two. Beginning in 1969, Corll paid Brooks in cash or with gifts to allow him to perform fellatio on the youth. Brooks' parents were divorced. His father lived in Houston and his mother had relocated to Beaumont, a city 85 miles, 140 kilometers east of Houston. In 1970, when he was 15, Brooks dropped out of Waltrip High School and moved to Beaumont to live with his mother. Whenever he visited his father in Houston, he also visited Corll, who allowed him to stay at his apartment if he wished to. Later the same year, Brooks moved back to Houston. By his own later admission, Brooks began regarding Corll's apartment as his second home. By the time Brooks dropped out of high school, Corll's mother and Joyce, his half-sister, had moved to Colorado after the failure of her third marriage and the closure of the family candy company in June 1968. Although she often talked to her eldest son on the telephone, his mother never saw him again. Following the closure of the candy company, Corll took a job as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company, where he tested electrical relay systems. He worked in this employment until the day he was killed by Elmer Wayne Hunley. Murders between 1970 and 1973, Corll is known to have killed a minimum of 28 victims. All of his victims were males aged 13 to 20, the majority of whom were in their mid-teens. Most victims were abducted from Houston Heights, which was then a low-income neighborhood northwest of downtown Houston. With most abductions, he was assisted by one or both of his teenage accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks. Several victims were friends of either or both of Corll's accomplices. Others were individuals with whom Corll had himself become acquainted prior to their abduction and murder. And two other victims, Billy Balch and Gregory Malleywinkle, were former employees of the Corll Candy Company. Corll's victims were usually lured into either one of the two vehicles he owned, a Ford Econoline van and a Plymouth GTX or a 1969 Chevrolet Corvette he is known to have purchased for David Brooks in early 1971. This enticement was typically an offer of a party or a lift, and the victim would be driven to his house. At Corll's residence, the youths would be plied with alcohol or other drugs until they passed out, tricked into donning handcuffs, or simply grabbed by force. They were then stripped naked and tied to either Corll's bed or, usually, a plywood torture board, which was regularly hung on a wall. Once manacled, the victims would be sexually assaulted, beaten, tortured and, sometimes after several days, killed by strangulation or shooting with a .22 caliber pistol. Their bodies were then tied in plastic sheeting and buried in one of four places: a rented boat shed, a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula, a woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn, where Corll's family owned a lakeside log cabin, or a beach in Jefferson County. In several instances, Corll forced his victims to either phone or write to their parents with explanations for their absences in an effort to allay the parents' fears for their son's safety. Corll is also known to have retained keepsakes, usually keys, from his victims. During the years in which he abducted and murdered his victims, Corll often changed addresses. However, until he moved to Pasadena in the spring of 1973, he always lived in or close to Houston Heights. First known murders. Corll killed his first known victim, an 18-year-old college freshman, Jeffrey Conan, on September 25, 1970. Conan vanished while hitchhiking with another student from the University of Texas to his parents' home in Houston. He was dropped off alone at the corner of Westheimer Road and South Voss Road near the uptown area of Houston. Corll likely offered Conan a lift to his parents' home, which Conan evidently accepted. At the time of Conan's disappearance, Corll lived in an apartment on Yorktown Street, near the intersection with Westheimer Road. David Brooks led police to the body of Jeffrey Conan on August 10, 1973. The body was buried at High Island Beach. Forensic scientists subsequently deduced that the youth had died of asphyxiation caused by manual strangulation and a cloth gag that had been placed in his mouth. The body was found buried beneath a large boulder, covered with a layer of lime, wrapped in plastic, naked, and bound hand and foot, suggesting he had been violated. About the time of Conan's murder, David Brooks interrupted Corll in the act of sexually assaulting two teenage boys whom he, Corll, had strapped to a four-poster bed. Corll promised Brooks a car in return for his silence. Brooks accepted the offer and Corll later bought him a green Chevrolet Corvette. Corll later told Brooks that he had killed the two youths and offered him $200 for any boy he could lure to Corll's apartment. On December 13, 1970, Brooks lured two 14-year-old Spring Branch youths named James Glass and Danny Yates away from a religious rally held in the Heights district of Houston to Corll's Yorktown apartment. Glass was an acquaintance of Brooks who, at Brooks' behest, had previously visited Corll's address. Both youths were tied to opposite sides of Corll's torture board and subsequently raped, strangled and buried in a boat shed he had rented on November 17. An electrical cord with alligator clips attached to each end was buried alongside Yates's body. 6 weeks after the double murder of Glass and Yates, on January 30, 1971, Brooks and Corll encountered two teenage brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, walking toward their parents' home. The Waldrop brothers had been driven to a friend's home by their father with plans to discuss forming a bowling league, and had begun walking home after learning their friend was not at home. Both boys were enticed into Corll's van and driven to an apartment Corll had rented on Mangum Road, where they were raped, tortured, strangled and subsequently buried in the boat shed. Between March and May 1971, Corll abducted and killed 3 victims, all of whom lived in Houston Heights and all of whom were buried toward the rear of the rented boat shed. In each of these abductions, Brooks is known to have been a participant. One of these 3 victims, 15-year-old Randall Harvey, was last seen by his family on the afternoon of March 9, cycling towards Oak Forest, where he worked part-time as a gas station attendant. Harvey was driven to Corll's Mangum Road apartment, where he was subsequently killed by a single gunshot to the head. The other 2 victims, 13-year-old David Hillegeest and 16-year-old Gregory Malleywinkle, were abducted and killed together on the afternoon of May 29, 1971. As had been the case with parents of other victims of Corll, both sets of parents launched a frantic search for their sons. One of the youths who voluntarily offered to distribute posters the parents had printed offering a reward for information leading to the boys' whereabouts was 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, a lifelong friend of Hillegeest. The youth pinned the reward posters around the Heights and attempted to reassure Hillegeest's parents that there may be an innocent explanation for the boys' absence. On August 17, 1971, Corll and Brooks encountered a 17-year-old acquaintance of Brooks named Reuben Watson Haney walking home from a movie theater in Houston. Brooks persuaded Haney to attend a party at an address Corll had moved to on San Felipe Street the previous month. Haney agreed and was taken to Corll's home where he was subsequently strangled and buried in the boat shed. In September 1971, Corll moved to another apartment in the Heights. Brooks later stated he had assisted Corll in the abduction and murder of 2 youths during the time Corll resided at this address, including one youth who was killed just before Wayne Henley came into the picture. In his confession, Brooks stated the youth killed immediately prior to Henley's involvement in the murders was abducted from the Heights and kept alive for approximately 4 days before his murder. The identity of both of these 2 victims remains unknown. Participation of Elmer Wayne Henley. In the winter of 1971, Brooks introduced Elmer Wayne Henley to Dean Corll. Henley likely was lured to Corll's address as an intended victim. However, Corll evidently decided the youth would make a good accomplice and offered him the same fee, $200, for any boy he could lure to his apartment, informing Henley that he was involved in a white slavery ring operating from Dallas. Henley later stated that, for several months, he ignored Corll's offer. However, in early 1972, he decided to accept the offer because he and his family were in dire financial circumstances. Henley said the first abduction he participated in occurred during the time Corll resided at 925 Schuler Street, an address Corll moved to in February 1972. Brooks later claimed that Henley became involved in the abductions while Corll resided at the address he had occupied immediately prior to Schuler Street. If Henley's statement is to be believed, the victim was abducted from the Heights in February 1972. In the statement Henley gave to police following his arrest, the youth stated he and Corll picked up a boy at the corner of 11th and Stewart Wood, and lured him to Corll's home on the promise of smoking some marijuana with the pair. At Corll's residence, using a ruse he and Corll had prepared, Henley cuffed his own hands behind his back, freed himself with a key hidden in his back pocket, then duped the youth into donning the handcuffs before observing Corll bind and gag him. Henley then left the youth alone with Corll, believing he was to be sold into the sexual slavery ring. The identity of this first victim Henley assisted in the abduction of remains unknown. Less than 1 month later, on February 24, 1972, Henley, Brooks and Corll encountered an 18-year-old acquaintance of Henley's named Frank Aguirre leaving a restaurant on Yale Street, where the youth worked. Henley called Aguirre over to Corll's van and invited the youth to drink beer and smoke marijuana with the trio at Corll's apartment. Aguirre agreed and followed the trio to Corll's home in his Rambler. Inside Corll's house, Aguirre smoked marijuana with the trio before picking up a pair of handcuffs Corll had left on his table. In response, Corll pounced on Aguirre, pushed him onto the table and cuffed his hands behind his back. Henley later claimed that he had not known of Corll's true intentions towards Aguirre when he had persuaded the youth to accompany him to Corll's home. In a 2010 interview, he claimed to have attempted to persuade Corll not to assault and kill Aguirre once Corll and Brooks had bound and gagged the youth. However, Corll refused, informing Henley that he had raped, tortured and killed the previous victim he had assisted in abducting, and that he intended to do the same with Aguirre. Henley subsequently assisted Corll and Brooks in Aguirre's burial at High Island Beach. Despite the revelations that Corll was in reality killing the boys he and Brooks had assisted in abducting, Henley nonetheless became an active participant in the abductions and murders. 2 months later, on April 20, 1972, he assisted Corll and Brooks in the abduction of another youth, a 17-year-old named Mark Scott. Scott, who was well known to both Henley and Brooks, was grabbed by force and fought furiously against attempts by Corll to restrain him, even attempting to stab his attackers with a knife. However, Scott saw Henley pointing a pistol toward him and according to Brooks, Scott just gave up. Scott was tied to the torture board and suffered the same fate as Aguirre: rape, torture, strangulation and burial at High Island Beach. Brooks stated Henley was especially sadistic in his participation in the murders committed at Schuler Street. Before Corll vacated the address on June 26, Henley assisted Corll and Brooks in the abduction and murder of two youths named Billy Balch and Johnny Delhomme. In Brooks' confession, he stated that both youths were tied to Corll's bed and, after their torture and rape, Henley manually strangled Balch, then shouted, "Hey, Johnny," and shot Delhomme in the forehead, with the bullet exiting through the youth's ear. Delhomme then pleaded with Henley, "Wayne, please don't," before he was strangled. Both youths were buried at High Island Beach. During the time Corll resided at Schuler Street, the trio lured a 19-year-old named Billy Rittinger to the house. Rittinger was tied to the plywood board, tortured and abused by Corll. Brooks later claimed he persuaded Corll to allow Rittinger to be released, and the youth was allowed to leave the residence. On another occasion during the time Corll resided at Schuler Street, Henley knocked Brooks unconscious as he entered the house. Corll then tied Brooks to his bed and assaulted the youth repeatedly before releasing him. Despite the assault, Brooks continued to assist Corll in the abductions of the victims. After vacating the Schuler residence, Corll moved to an apartment at Westcott Towers, where, in the summer of 1972, he is known to have killed a further two victims. The first of these victims, 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, was last seen leaving a party held in the Heights shortly before midnight on July 19. The youth was savagely bludgeoned about the chest with a blunt instrument before he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. Approximately 1 month later, on or about August 21, a 19-year-old named Roy Bunton was abducted while walking to his job as an assistant in a Houston shoe store. Bunton was gagged with a section of Turkish towel and his mouth bound with adhesive tape. He was shot twice in the head and buried in the boat shed. Neither youth was named by either Brooks or Henley as being a victim of Corll, and both youths were only identified as victims in 2011. On October 2, 1972, Henley and Brooks encountered two Heights youths, Wally J. Cimino and Richard Humbry. Henley and Brooks spotted the youths walking to Humbry's home. Cimino and Humbry were enticed into Brooks' Corvette and driven to Corll's Westcott Towers apartment. That evening, Cimino is known to have phoned his mother's home and to have shouted the word "Mama" into the receiver before the connection was terminated. The following morning, Humbry was accidentally shot in the mouth by Henley, with the bullet exiting through his neck. Several hours later, both youths were strangled to death and subsequently buried in a common grave inside Corll's boat shed directly above the bodies of James Glass and Danny Yates. Sometime the following month, an 18-year-old Oak Forest youth known to both Corll and Henley named Willard Branch disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston. His gagged and emasculated body was buried in the boat shed, and on November 15, a 19-year-old Heights youth named Richard Kepner disappeared on his way to a phone booth. Kepner was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. Altogether, a minimum of 10 teenagers between the ages of 13 and 19 were murdered between February and November 1972, 5 of whom were buried at High Island Beach, and 5 inside Corll's boat shed. On January 20, 1973, Corll moved to an address on Wirt Road in the Spring Branch district of Houston. Within 2 weeks of moving into this address, he had killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. Lyles was known to both Corll and Brooks. He had lived on Antoine Drive, the same street upon which Brooks resided in 1973. On March 7, Corll vacated his Wirt Road apartment and moved to 2020 Lamar Drive, an address his father had vacated in Pasadena. 2020 Lamar Drive. No known victims were killed between February 1 and June 4, 1973. Corll is known to have suffered from a hydrocele in early 1973, which may have contributed to this period of inactivity. In addition, around the time of Lyle's murder, Henley had temporarily moved away from Houston to Mount Pleasant in an apparent effort to distance himself from Corll. These facts may account for this sudden lull in killings. Nonetheless, from June, Corll's rate of killings increased dramatically, and both Henley and Brooks later testified to the increase in the level of brutality of the murders committed while Corll resided at Lamar Drive. Henley later compared the acceleration in the frequency of killings and the increase in the brutality exhibited by Corll toward his victims to being like a bloodlust, adding that he and Brooks would instinctively know when Corll was to announce that he needed to do a new boy, due to the fact that he would appear restless, smoking cigarettes and making reflex movements. On June 4, Henley and Corll abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. The youth was last seen alive by his father on 31st Street. After 3 days of abuse and torture, Lawrence was strangled before being buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn was abducted, strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 6, 1973, Wayne Henley began attending classes at the coach's driving school in Bel-Air, where he became acquainted with 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia. The following day, Garcia phoned his mother to say he was spending the night with a friend. He was shot and left to bleed to death in Corll's bathtub before he was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. 5 days later, on July 12, 17-year-old John Sellers of Orange County was bound, shot to death and buried at High Island Beach. In July 1973, David Brooks married his pregnant fiancée, and Henley temporarily became Corll's sole procurer of victims, assisting in the abduction and murder of 3 Heights youths between July 19 and 25. Henley claimed these 3 abductions were the only 3 that occurred after his becoming an accomplice to Corll, in which David Brooks was not a participant. One of these 3 victims, 15-year-old Michael Balch, brother of previous victim Billy Balch, was last seen by his family on July 19 on his way to get a haircut. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. The other 2 victims, Charles Corll and Marty Ray Jones, were abducted together on the afternoon of July 25. Henley himself later buried both youths' bodies in the boat shed. On August 3, 1973, Corll killed his last victim, a 13-year-old boy from South Houston named James Stanton Dramala. Dramala was abducted by Brooks and Corll while riding his bike in Pasadena and driven to Lamar Drive upon the pretense of collecting empty glass bottles to resell. At Corll's home, Dramala was tied to Corll's torture board, raped, tortured and strangled with a cord before being buried in the boat shed. David Brooks later described Dramala as a small, blond boy, for whom he had bought a pizza and in whose company he had spent 45 minutes before the youth was attacked. August 8, 1973. On the evening of August 7, 1973, Henley, age 17, invited a 19-year-old named Timothy Cordell Curley to attend a party at Corll's Pasadena residence. Curley, a casual acquaintance of Corll's who was intended to be his next victim, accepted the offer. David Brooks was not present at the time. The two youths arrived at Corll's house, where they sniffed paint fumes and drank alcohol until midnight before leaving the house to purchase sandwiches. Henley and Curley then drove back to Houston Heights and Curley parked his vehicle close to Henley's home. Henley exited the vehicle and, hearing commotion across the street emanating from the home of his 15-year-old friend Rhonda Louise Williams, walked toward her home. Williams had been beaten by her drunken father that evening and accepted Henley's invitation to join himself and Curley at Corll's home. Williams climbed into the back seat of Curley's Volkswagen. The trio then drove toward Corll's Pasadena residence. At approximately 3 a.m. on the morning of August 8, 1973, Henley and Curley, accompanied by Williams, returned to Corll's residence. Corll was furious that Henley had brought a girl to his house, telling him in private that he had ruined everything. Henley explained that Williams had argued with her father that evening, and did not wish to return home. Corll appeared to calm down, and offered the trio beer and marijuana. The three teenagers began drinking and smoking marijuana, with Henley and Curley also sniffing paint fumes as Corll watched them intently. After approximately 2 hours, Henley, Curley, and Williams each passed out. The shooting Henley awoke to find himself lying upon his stomach and Corll snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. His mouth had been taped shut and his ankles had been bound together. Curley and Williams lay beside Henley, securely bound with nylon rope, gagged with adhesive tape and lying face down on the floor. Curley had been stripped naked. Noting Henley had awoken, Corll removed the gag from his mouth. Henley protested in vain against Corll's actions, whereupon Corll reiterated that he was angry with Henley for bringing a girl to his house and that he was going to kill all three teenagers after he had assaulted and tortured Curley, initially stating, "Man, you blew it bringing that girl," before shouting, "I'm gonna kill you all. But first I'm gonna have my fun." He then repeatedly kicked Williams in the chest before dragging Henley into his kitchen and placing a .22 caliber pistol against his stomach, threatening to shoot him. Henley calmed Corll, promising to participate in the torture and murder of both Williams and Curley if Corll released him. Corll agreed and untied Henley, then carried Curley and Williams into his bedroom and tied them to opposite sides of his torture board. Curley on his stomach, Williams on her back. Corll then handed Henley a hunting knife and ordered him to cut away Williams' clothes, insisting that, while he would rape and kill Curley, Henley would do likewise to Williams. Henley began cutting away Williams' clothes as Corll undressed and began to assault and torture Curley. Both Curley and Williams had awakened by this point. Curley began writhing and shouting as Williams, whose gag Henley had removed, lifted her head and asked Henley, "Is this for real?" To which Henley answered, "Yes." Williams then asked Henley, "Are you going to do anything about it?" Henley then asked Corll whether he might take Williams into another room. Corll ignored him and Henley then grabbed Corll's pistol, shouting, "You've gone far enough, Dean." As Corll clambered off Curley, Henley elaborated, I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends. Corll approached Henley, saying, "Kill me, Wayne." Henley stepped back a few paces as Corll continued to advance upon him, shouting, "You won't do it." Henley then fired at Corll, hitting him in the forehead. The bullet failed to fully penetrate Corll's skull, and he continued to lurch toward Henley, whereupon the youth fired another 2 rounds, hitting Corll in the left shoulder. Corll then ran out of the room, hitting the wall of the hallway. Henley fired 3 additional bullets into his lower back and shoulder as Corll slid down the wall in the hallway outside the room where the 2 other teenagers were bound. Corll died where he fell, his naked body lying face toward the wall. Henley would later recall that, having shot Corll, the sole thought in his mind in the moments immediately thereafter was that Corll would have been proud of the way he had reacted to the confrontation, adding that Corll had been training him to react fast and react greatly, and that was what he had done. After he had shot Corll, Henley released Curley and Williams from the torture board, and all 3 teenagers dressed and discussed what actions they should take. Henley suggested to Curley and Williams that they should simply leave, to which Curley replied, "No, we should call the police." Henley agreed and looked up the number for the Pasadena police in Corll's telephone directory. Contacting police at 8:24 a.m. on August 8, 1973, Henley placed a call to the Pasadena police. His call was answered by an operator named Velma Lines. In his call, Henley blurted to the operator, "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." Henley gave the address to the operator as 2020 Lamar Drive, Pasadena. As Curley, Williams and Henley waited upon Corll's porch for the police to arrive, Henley mentioned to Curley that he had done that kill by shooting 4 or 5 times. Minutes later, a Pasadena police car arrived at 2020 Lamar Drive. The 3 teenagers were sitting on the porch outside the house, and the officer noted the .22 caliber pistol on the driveway near the trio. Henley told the officer that he was the individual who had made the call and indicated that the body of Dean Corll was inside the house. After confiscating the pistol and placing Henley, Williams and Curley inside the patrol car, the officer entered the bungalow and discovered Corll's body inside the hallway. The officer returned to the car and read Henley his Miranda rights. In response, Henley shouted, "I don't care who knows about it. I have to get it off my chest." Curley later told detectives that before the police officer had arrived at Lamar Drive, Henley had informed him, "If you weren't my friend, I could have gotten $200 for you." Confession in custody at the Pasadena Police Department, Henley initially was questioned in relation to the killing of Dean Corll. He recounted the events of the previous evening and that morning, explaining that he had shot Corll in self-defense. The statements given by Curley and Williams corroborated Henley's account, and the detective questioning Henley believed he had indeed acted in self-defense. When questioned regarding his claim that as Corll had threatened him that morning he had shouted that he had killed several boys, Henley explained that for almost 3 years, he and David Brooks had helped procure teenage boys, some of whom had been their own friends, for Corll, who had raped and murdered them. Henley gave a verbal statement, stating he initially had believed the boys he had abducted were to be sold into a Dallas-based organization for homosexual acts, sodomy, maybe later killing, but soon learned Corll was himself killing the victims procured. Henley admitted he had assisted Corll in several abductions and murders, and that he had actively participated in the torture and mutilation of 6 or 8 victims prior to their murder. Most victims had been buried in a southwest Houston boat shed, with others buried at Lake Sam Rayburn and High Island Beach. Corll had paid up to $200 for each victim he or Brooks were able to lure to his apartment. Police initially were skeptical of Henley's claims, assuming the sole homicide of the case was that of Corll, which they had ascribed to being the result of drug-fueled fisticuffs that had turned deadly. Henley was quite insistent, however, and upon his recalling the names of 3 boys, Corll, Hilligiest and Jones, whom he stated he and David Brooks had procured for Corll. The police accepted that there was something to his claims, as all three teenagers were listed as missing at Houston Police Headquarters. David Hilligiest had been reported missing in the summer of 1971. The other two boys had been missing for just 2 weeks. Moreover, the floor of the room where the three teenagers had been tied was covered in thick plastic sheeting. Police also found a plywood torture board measuring 8 by 3 feet, 2.44 by 0.91 meters, with handcuffs attached to nylon rope at 2 corners, and nylon ropes to the other 2. Also found at Corll's address were a large hunting knife, rolls of clear plastic of the same type used to cover the floor, a portable radio rigged to a pair of dry cells to give increased volume, an electric motor with loose wires attached, 8 pairs of handcuffs, a number of dildos, thin glass tubes and lengths of rope. Corll's Ford Econoline van parked in the driveway conveyed a similar impression. The rear windows of the van were sealed by opaque blue curtains. In the rear of the vehicle, police found a coil of rope, a swatch of beige rug covered in soil stains, and a wooden crate with air holes drilled in the sides. The pegboard walls inside the rear of the van were rigged with several rings and hooks. Another wooden crate with air holes drilled in the sides was found in Corll's backyard. Inside this crate were several strands of human hair. Search for victims. Henley agreed to accompany police to Corll's boat shed in southwest Houston, where he claimed the bodies of most of the victims could be found. Inside Corll's boat shed, police found a half-stripped car, which turned out to have been stolen from a used car lot in March, a child's bike, a large iron drum, water containers, 2 sacks of lime, and a large plastic bag full of teenage boys' clothing. 2 prison trustees began digging through the soft, shell-crushed earth of the boat shed and soon uncovered the body of a young blonde-haired teenage boy, lying on his side, encased in clear plastic and buried beneath a layer of lime. Police continued excavating through the earth of the shed, unearthing the remains of more victims in varying stages of decomposition. Most of the bodies found were wrapped in thick, clear plastic sheeting. Some victims had been shot, others strangled, the ligature still wrapped tightly around their necks. All of the victims found had been sodomized, and most victims found bore evidence of sexual torture. Pubic hairs had been plucked out, genitals had been chewed, objects had been inserted into their rectums, and glass rods had been inserted into their urethra and smashed. Cloth rags had also been inserted into the victims' mouths and adhesive tape wound around their faces to muffle their screams. The mouth of the third victim unearthed on August 8 was so agape that all upper and lower teeth were visible, leading investigators to theorize the youth had died with a scream on his lips. After the recovery of the 8th body from the boat shed was completed at 11:55 p.m., the investigation was discontinued until the next day. Accompanied by his father, David Brooks presented himself at the Houston police station on the evening of August 8, and gave a statement in which he denied any participation in the murders, but admitted to having known that Corll had raped and killed 2 youths in 1970. The morning of August 9, 1973, Henley gave a full written statement detailing his and Brooks' involvement with Dean Corll in the abduction and murder of numerous youths. In this confession, Henley readily admitted to having personally killed approximately 9 youths and to have assisted Corll in the strangulation of others. He stated the only 3 abductions and murders Brooks had not assisted him and Corll with were 3 murders committed in the summer of 1973. That afternoon, Henley accompanied police to Lake Sam Rayburn in San Augustine County, where he, Brooks and Corll had buried 4 victims killed that year. 2 additional bodies were found in shallow, lime-soaked graves located close to a dirt road. Inside a lakeside log cabin owned by Corll's family, police found a second plywood torture board, rolls of plastic sheeting, shovels and a sack of lime. Police found 9 additional bodies in the boat shed on August 9. These bodies were recovered between 12:05 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., and all were in an advanced state of decomposition. One of the bodies unearthed bore evidence of sexual mutilation. The severed genitals of the victim were found inside a sealed plastic bag placed beside the body. Another victim unearthed had several fractured ribs. The 13th and 14th bodies unearthed bore identification cards naming the victims as Donald and Jerry Waldrop. David Brooks gave a full confession on the evening of August 9, admitting to being present at several killings and assisting in several burials, although he continued to deny any direct participation in the murders. In reference to the torture board upon which Corll had restrained and tortured his victims, Brooks stated, "Once they were on the board, they were as good as dead. It was all over but the shouting and the crying." He agreed to accompany police to High Island Beach to assist in the search for the bodies of the victims. On August 10, 1973, Henley again accompanied police to Lake Sam Rayburn, where two more bodies were found buried just 10 feet, 3 meters apart. As with the two bodies found the previous day, both victims had been tortured and severely beaten, particularly around the head. That afternoon, both Henley and Brooks accompanied police to High Island Beach, leading police to the shallow graves of two victims. On August 13, both Henley and Brooks again accompanied the police to High Island Beach, where 4 more bodies were found, making a total of 27 known victims. The worst killing spree in American history at the time. Henley initially insisted that there were 2 more bodies to be found inside the boat shed, and that the bodies of 2 more boys had been buried at High Island Beach in 1972. At the time, the killing spree was the worst case of serial murder, in terms of the number of victims, in the United States, exceeding the 25 murders attributed to Juan Corona, who had been arrested in California in 1971 for killing 25 men. The macabre record number of known victims attributed to a single murder case set by the Houston mass murders was only surpassed in 1978 by John Wayne Gacy, who murdered 33 boys and young men and who admitted to being influenced by Corll and his accomplices. Families of Corll's victims were highly critical of the Houston Police Department, which had been quick to list the missing boys as runaways who had not been considered worthy of any major investigation. The families of the murdered youths asserted that the police should have noted an insidious trend in the pattern of disappearances of teenage boys from the Heights neighborhood. Other family members complained the police had been dismissive of their adamant insistence that their sons had no reasons to run away from home. Everett Waldrop, the father of Donald and Jerry Waldrop, complained that shortly after his sons had disappeared in 1971, he had informed police an acquaintance had observed Corll burying what appeared to be bodies at his boat shed. In response, the police performed a perfunctory search around the shed, before dismissing the reports as a hoax. Waldrop stated that on one occasion when he visited the Houston Police Department, the police chief had simply told him, "Why are you down here? You know your boys are runaways." The mother of Gregory Malleywinkle stated, "You don't run away from home with nothing but a bathing suit and 80 cents. By May 1974, 21 of Corll's victims had been identified, with all but 4 of the youths having either lived in or had close connections to Houston Heights. 2 more teenagers were identified in 1983 and 1985, one of whom, Richard Kapner, also lived in Houston Heights. The other youth, Willard Branch, lived in the Oak Forest district of Houston. Indictment. On August 13, a grand jury convened in Harris County to hear evidence against Henley and Brooks. The first witnesses to testify were Rhonda Williams and Tim Curley, who testified to the events of August 7 and 8 leading to the death of Dean Corll. Another witness who testified to his experience at the hands of Dean Corll was Billy Rittinger. After listening to over 6 hours of testimony from various people, on August 14, the jury initially indicted Henley on 3 murder charges and Brooks on 1 count. Bail for each youth was set at $100,000. The district attorney requested that Henley undergo a psychiatric examination to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial, but his attorney, Charles Melder, opposed the decision, stating the move would violate Henley's constitutional rights. By the time the grand jury had completed its investigation, Henley had been indicted for 6 murders, and Brooks for 4. Henley was not charged with the death of Dean Corll, which prosecutors ruled on September 18 had been committed in self-defense. Trials, convictions and incarcerations. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks were tried separately for their roles in the murders. Henley was brought to trial in San Antonio on July 1, 1974, charged with 6 murders committed between March 1972 and July 1973. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses, including Tim Curley and a youth named Billy Rittinger, who had been lured to Corll's Schuler Street address by Henley, Brooks and Corll in 1972. Rittinger testified that at Corll's home he was tied to Corll's torture board and assaulted repeatedly by Corll before he was released. Other incriminating testimony came from police officers who read from Henley's written statements. In one part of his confession, Henley had described his luring of 2 of the victims for whose murder he had been brought to trial, Charles Corll and Marty Jones, to Corll's Pasadena house. Henley had confessed that after their initial abuse and torture at Corll's home, Corll and Jones each had one wrist and ankle bound to the same side of Corll's torture board. The youths were then forced by Corll to fight each other with the promise that the youth who beat the other to death would be allowed to live. After several hours of each youth beating the other, Jones was tied to a board and forced to watch Charles Corll again be assaulted, tortured and shot to death before he himself was again raped, tortured and strangled with a Venetian blind cord. The 2 youths were killed on July 27, 1973, 2 days after they had been reported missing. Several victims' parents had to leave the courtroom to regain their composure as police and medical examiners described how their relatives were tortured and murdered. Throughout the trial, the state introduced 82 pieces of evidence, including Corll's torture board and one of the boxes used to transport the victims. Inside the box, police had found hair which examiners had concluded came from both Charles Corll and Wayne Henley. Upon advice from his defense counsel, Henley did not take the stand to testify. His defense attorney, Will Gray, cross-examined several witnesses but did not call any witnesses or experts for the defense. On July 15, 1974, both counsels presented their closing arguments to the jury, the prosecution seeking life imprisonment, the defense a verdict of not guilty. In his closing argument to the jury, District Attorney Carol Vance apologized for his not being able to seek the death penalty, adding that the case was the most extreme example of man's inhumanity to man I have ever seen. The jury deliberated for 92 minutes before finding Henley guilty of all 6 murders for which he was tried. The following day, July 16, formal procedures to sentence Henley for the 6 guilty verdicts began, and on August 8, Judge Preston Dial ordered that Henley serve each 99-year sentence consecutively, totaling 594 years, and he was transferred to the Huntsville unit to formally begin his sentence. Henley appealed his sentence and conviction, contending the jury in his initial trial had not been sequestered, that his attorney's objections to news media being present in the courtroom had been overruled, and citing that his defense team's attempts to present evidence contending that the initial trial should not have been held in San Antonio had also been overruled by the judge. Henley's appeal was upheld and he was awarded a retrial in December 1978. Henley's retrial began on June 18, 1979. This second trial was held in Corpus Christi, with Henley again represented by defense attorneys Will Gray and Ed Pagello. Henley's attorneys again attempted to have Henley's written statements ruled inadmissible. However, Judge Noah Kennedy ruled the written statements given by Henley on August 9, 1973 as admissible evidence. The retrial lasted 9 days, with Henley's attorneys again calling no defense witnesses and again attacking the credibility of Henley's written confession. The defense also contended the evidence provided by the state belonged to Dean Corll, not Elmer Wayne Henley. On June 27, 1979, the jury deliberated for over 2 hours before reaching their verdict. Henley was again convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to 6 concurrent 99-year terms. Brooks was brought to trial on February 27, 1975. Brooks had been indicted for 4 murders committed between December 1970 and June 1973, but was brought to trial charged only with the June 1973 murder of 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. Brooks' defense attorney, Jim Skelton, argued that his client had not committed any murders and attempted to portray Corll and, to a lesser degree, Henley as being the active participants in the actual killings. Assistant District Attorney Tommy Dunn dismissed the defense's contention outright, at one point telling the jury, "This defendant was in on this killing, this murderous rampage, from the very beginning. He tells you he was a cheerleader if nothing else. That's what he was telling you about his presence. You know he was in on it." Brooks' trial lasted less than 1 week. The jury deliberated for just 90 minutes before they reached a verdict. He was found guilty of Lawrence's murder on March 4, 1975, and sentenced to life imprisonment. Brooks showed no emotion as the sentence was passed, although his wife burst into tears. Brooks also appealed his sentence, contending that the signed confessions used against him were taken without his being informed of his legal rights, but his appeal was dismissed in May 1979. Henley is serving his life sentence and is incarcerated at the Mark W. Michael Unit in Anderson County, Texas. Brooks served his life sentence at the Terrell Unit near Rocheron, Texas prior to his death at a Galveston hospital on May 28, 2020. His death has been ruled as COVID-19 related. Victims Corll and his accomplices are known to have killed a minimum of 28 teenagers and young men between September 1970 and August 1973, although it is suspected that the true number of victims may be 29 or more. As Corll had been killed immediately prior to his murders being discovered, the true number of victims he had claimed will never be known. To date, 27 of Corll's known victims have been identified, and the identity of a 28th victim whose body has never been found is conclusively known. All of these victims had been killed by either shooting, strangulation, or a combination of both. 1970 September 25. Jeffrey Allen Conan, 18, a student at the University of Texas at Austin, abducted while hitchhiking from Austin to the Broswood Place district of Houston. He was buried at High Island Beach. December 13. James Eugene Glass, 14, an acquaintance of Corll who also knew David Brooks. Glass was last seen by his brother in the company of Danny Yates walking toward the exit of the church the trio had attended. He was strangled with a cord and buried inside the boat shed. December 13. Danny Michael Yates, 14, lured with his friend James Glass from a Heights evangelical rally by David Brooks to Corll's Yorktown apartment. He and his friend were strangled before being buried in a common grave in Corll's boat shed. 1971 January 30. Donald Wayne Waldrop, 15, vanished on his way to visit a friend to discuss forming a bowling league. Brooks claimed Donald's father, who was a builder, was working on the apartment next to Corll's at the time that Donald and his brother were murdered. January 30. Jerry Lynn Waldrop, 13, the youngest of Corll's victims. He and his brother were strangled and buried in a common grave inside Corll's boat shed. March 9. Randall Lee Harvey, 15, disappeared on his way home from his job as a gas station attendant. He was shot in the head and buried in Corll's boat shed. Remains identified October 2008. May 29. David William Hillegeist, 13, one of Henley's earliest childhood friends. Hillegeist was last seen in the company of his friend Gregory Malleywinkle walking to a local swimming pool. The two were last seen climbing into a white van. May 29. Gregory Malleywinkle, 16, a former employee of Corll Candy Company and boyfriend of Randall Harvey's sister. Winkle last phoned his mother claiming he and Hillegeist were swimming in Freeport. His body was found in the boat shed with the cord used to strangle him knotted around his neck. August 17, Reuben Wilford Watson Haney, 17, left his home to visit the cinema on the afternoon of August 17. Haney later called his mother to tell her he was spending the evening with Brooks. He was gagged, strangled and buried in Corll's boat shed. 1972 February 24, Frank Anthony Aguirre, 18. Aguirre had been engaged to marry Rhonda Williams, whose presence in Corll's house would later spark the fatal confrontation between Henley and Corll. He was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. April 20, Mark Stephen Scott, 17, a friend of both Henley and Brooks who was killed at Corll's Schuler Street address. He was forced to write a letter to his parents claiming that he found a job in Austin. Henley stated Scott was strangled and buried at High Island Beach, although his remains were never found. May 21, Johnny Ray DeLome, 16, a Heights youth who was last seen with his friend walking to a local store. He was shot in the head, then strangled by Henley. May 21, Billy Jean Balch Jr., 17, a former employee of Corll Candy Company. Balch was forced to write a letter to his parents claiming he and DeLome had found work in Madisonville before he was strangled by Henley and buried at High Island Beach. July 19, Stephen Kent Sigmund, 17. Sigmund was last seen leaving a party held in the Heights. He suffered several fractured ribs before he was strangled with a nylon cord and buried in the boat shed. Remains misidentified December 1993 and correctly identified March 2011. C. August 21, Roy Eugene Bunton, 19, disappeared on his way to work at a shoe store. He was shot twice in the head and buried in the boat shed. Remains misidentified October 1973 and correctly identified November 2011. October 2, Wally J. Simoneau, 14, lured with his friend into Brooks' Corvette on the night of October 2. Simoneau attempted to call his mother at Corll's residence before the phone was disconnected. He was strangled and buried in Corll's boat shed. October 2, Richard Edward Hembry, 13, last seen alongside his friend in a vehicle parked outside a Heights grocery store. He was shot in the mouth and strangled at Corll's Westcott Towers address. C. November 1, Willard Carmen Branch, Jr. 18, the son of a Houston police officer who subsequently died of a heart attack in the search for his son. Branch was emasculated before he was shot in the head and buried in the boat shed. Remains identified July 1985. November 15, Richard Allen Kapner, 19, vanished on his way to call his fiancée from a payphone. He was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. Remains identified September 1983. 1973 February 1, Joseph Allen Lyles, 17, an acquaintance of Corll who lived on the same street as Brooks. He was seen by Brooks to be grabbed by Corll at his Wirt Road address and was subsequently buried at Jefferson County Beach. Remains located August 1983 and identified November 2009. June 4, William Ray Lawrence, 15, a friend of Henley who phoned his father to ask if he could go fishing with some friends. He was kept alive by Corll for 3 days before he was strangled with a cord and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. June 15, Raymond Stanley Blackburn, 20, a married man from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who vanished while hitchhiking from the Heights to see his newborn child. Blackburn had arrived in Houston 3 months before his abduction to work on a construction project. He was strangled by Corll at his Lamar Drive residence and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. July 7, Homer Luis Garcia, 15, met Henley while both youths were enrolled at a Bel Air driving school. He was shot in the head and chest and left to bleed to death in Corll's bathtub before he was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. July 12, John Manning Sellers, 17, an Orange County youth killed 2 days before his 18th birthday. Sellers was killed by 4 gunshots to the chest and buried at High Island Beach. He was the only victim to be buried fully clothed. July 19, Michael Anthony Balch, 15. Corll had killed his older brother, Billy, the previous year. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Remains identified September 2010. July 25. Marty Ray Jones, 18. Jones was last seen along with his friend and roommate, Charles Corll, walking along 27th Street in the company of Henley. He was strangled with a Venetian blind cord and buried in the boat shed. July 25. Charles Kerry Corll, 17. A school friend of Henley whose wife was pregnant at the time of his murder. Corll last phoned his father in a state of hysteria claiming he and Jones had been kidnapped by drug dealers. His body, shot twice in the head, was found in the boat shed. August 3. James Stanton Dremala, 13. The son of Seventh-day Adventists, Dremala was last seen riding his bike in Pasadena. He last called his parents to tell them he was at a party across town. He was strangled and buried in the boat shed. Footnotes. At Henley's trial in 1974, Harris County Medical Examiner Joseph Joachimczyk raised questions as to whether John Sellers was actually a victim of Dean Corll. Sellers, a U.S. Marine who had been reported missing on July 12, 1973, had been killed by 4 gunshot wounds to the chest fired from a rifle, whereas all of Corll's other known victims had either been shot with the same pistol that Henley had used to kill Corll and/or strangled. Moreover, Sellers' car had been found burned out in Starks 1 week after the youth had disappeared. Police had been led to Sellers' body on August 13, 1973 by a trucker who recalled conversing with a youth he believed to be Henley after he had observed a car stuck in the sand close to where Sellers' body was subsequently found. The youth had rebuffed the trucker's offer of assisting to free the car, stating he had 2 friends with him who would free the vehicle. Neither Henley or Brooks specifically mentioned Sellers being a victim of Corll's in their confessions, nor have they disputed his being a victim. The official tally of victims was reduced to 26 in 1974 after Dr. Joachimczyk testified Sellers probably was not murdered by Corll and his accomplices. However, Sellers was of the same age as Corll's known victims and his grave on High Island Beach was close to where confirmed victims of Corll were buried. In addition, the youth's body was found bound hand and foot with rope as other victims had been, and Sellers' autopsy report indicates a possibility of his being sexually assaulted prior to or after death. Forensic developments. In June 2008, Dr. Sharon Derrick, a forensic anthropologist with the Medical Examiner's Office in Houston, released digital images of Corll's 3 still unidentified victims. The unidentified victims were listed as ML73-3349, ML73-3356 and ML73-3378. 2 of the unidentified victims were found buried in the boat shed and were estimated to have been killed in 1971 or 1972. ML73-3378 was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn just 10 feet, 3 meters from the body of Homer Garcia, who had disappeared on July 7, 1973. The victim was estimated to be in a slightly more advanced state of decomposition to Garcia, leading investigators to estimate that he had been killed in mid to late June 1973. On October 17, 2008, ML73-3349 was identified as Randy Lee Harvey, a Heights teenager who had been reported missing on March 11, 1971, 2 days after he had disappeared. Harvey, who had been shot through the eye, was wearing a navy blue jacket with red lining, jeans and lace-up boots. A plastic orange pocket comb was also found alongside his body. A body found on a beach in Jefferson County on August 4, 1983 is strongly believed to belong to a 28th victim of Dean Corll. The scattered skeletalized remains were discovered within and close to plastic sheet and near an eroding sandbank, along with sections of rope. These remains were listed as ML83-6849. The body was identified November 11, 2009, through DNA analysis as 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, a Heights teenager who had disappeared on February 1, 1973. Lyles is known to have both visited Corll's apartment and to have lived on the same street as David Brooks. He was listed as a possible victim of Corll after the other murders were discovered in 1973. At the time of his disappearance, Corll resided in an apartment at 1855 Wirt Road, where he lived between January 20 and March 7, 1973, when he moved to his father's Pasadena bungalow. Brooks had specifically stated Corll had got one boy by himself during the time he lived at this address. In addition, at the time that Lyles disappeared, Hanley had temporarily moved to Mount Pleasant, which leaves a strong possibility that Corll had killed Lyles without the assistance of Hanley. On September 13, 2010, DNA analysis was able to confirm that the unidentified victim known as ML73-3378 was actually Michael Anthony Balch, who had incorrectly been identified as case file ML73-3333, the second victim unearthed from the boat shed. Michael Balch had disappeared en route to a barber's on July 19, 1973, a year after his brother, Billy, had been murdered by Corll. The 1973 misidentification of Michael Balch was discovered as a result of an independent investigation conducted by a reporter named Barbara Gibson, who submitted her research to Dr. Derrick that indicated that the second victim unearthed from the boat shed had been misidentified. Hanley had stated in his confession to police that he and Corll had choked Michael Balch and buried him at Lake Sam Rayburn. The unidentified victim mistakenly identified as Michael Balch had been killed by 2 gunshots to the head and buried inside the boat shed. 3 factors had helped lead to the 1973 misidentification of Michael Balch. Michael's parents had previously filed a missing persons report on their son, who had previously left home to search for his older brother in August 1972. Precisely the same time as the second victim unearthed from the boat shed was estimated to have been killed. This was the only missing persons report on file for Michael Balch. In addition, the victim was of a similar height to Balch, and circumstantial dental fractures had also helped facilitate the misidentification. On November 4, 2011, the victim mistakenly identified as Michael Balch, case file ML73-3333, was identified through DNA analysis as Roy Eugene Bunton, a Heights teenager who was last seen by his family heading for work at a Houston shoe store on or about August 21, 1972. Bunton's family had always believed him to be a victim of Corll and had contacted Dr. Derrick in 2009 to submit a DNA sample for comparison with the unidentified bodies. Initially, the results conducted had been negative due to the misidentification of Bunton's remains as being those of Michael Balch. However, upon discovering the 1973 misidentification of Balch's remains, DNA samples obtained from Bunton's family were compared to those taken from the body mistakenly identified as being that of Michael Balch, and these proved to be a conclusive match to Roy Bunton. In the confession given by Elmer Wayne Hanley on August 9, 1973, the youth had stated that victim Mark Scott had been strangled and buried at High Island. David Brooks had also stated in his confession that Scott was likely buried at High Island. Scott had been a blond youth who had not had any teeth extracted prior to his disappearance. However, a Dr. Elizabeth Johnson of the Harris County Medical Institute had concluded in 1993 that the 15th set of remains unearthed from the boat shed, which had physical characteristics such as dark brown hair and 2 extracted molars, were those of Mark Scott. Dr. Johnson had based her findings upon comparison of DNA analysis of a blood sample taken from Scott's mother with the remains unearthed from the boat shed, stating with a 98.5% degree of accuracy the decedent had been related to Scott's mother. In a 2010 interview granted to an investigative reporter named Barbara Gibson, Henley disputed the 1993 identification of a victim buried in the boat shed as being Mark Scott and reiterated his claim that Scott had been buried at High Island, in the sand, fetal position, head up, adding that he had repeatedly argued this point with Dr. Jakimczyk. As a result of Henley's claims, DNA tests on the body initially identified as Scott were again tested against samples of DNA taken from Scott's family. In March 2011, DNA analysis confirmed that the victim known as ML73-3355 had been misidentified in the same month. The victim was identified as Stephen Kent Sickman, a 17-year-old who was last seen walking down West 34th Street shortly before midnight on July 19, 1972, and who was murdered at Corll's Westcott Towers address. Sickman's mother had reported her son missing shortly after his disappearance, but police had been unwilling to conduct a search for the youth, telling the mother that the youth was 17 years old and that unless they found a body, there was nothing they could do to assist her. Had Henley not been adamant in his assertion that the body of Mark Scott had been misidentified, Sickman would have never been conclusively confirmed as a victim of Corll. All 6 bodies directly linked to the Houston mass murders found at High Island have been identified. As Henley's claim that the victim known as ML73-3355 was not Mark Scott has been proven to be correct, a strong suspicion remains that the body of Mark Scott remains buried on High Island. Possible additional victims: 42 boys had vanished within the Houston area since 1970. The police were heavily criticized for curtailing the search for further victims once the record set by Juan Corona for having the most victims had been surpassed. After finding the 26th and 27th bodies, tied together, at High Island Beach on August 13, the search for any further victims was terminated, despite Henley's insistence that 2 further bodies had been buried on the beach in 1972. A curious feature about this final discovery was the presence of 2 extra bones, an arm bone and a pelvis, in the grave, indicating at least one additional, undiscovered victim. The 2 bodies that Henley had insisted were still buried on the beach may have been those of Mark Scott and Joseph Lyles. In light of developments relating to the identifications of victims, the body of Scott still lies undiscovered at High Island, while Lyles' remains were only found by chance in 1983. Had the search for bodies continued, both victims would have likely been discovered. Following Hurricane Ike in 2008, the area of High Island Beach where Corll is known to have buried his victims remains submerged, leaving a strong possibility that Scott's body will never be found. Former workers at the Corll Candy Company recalled Corll doing a lot of digging in the years leading up to 1968, when his mother's 3rd marriage was deteriorating and the firm was failing. Corll stated he was burying spoiled candy to avoid contamination by insects. He subsequently cemented over the floor. He was also observed digging in the waste ground that was later converted into a car park. Former Corll Candy Company employees also recalled that Corll had rolls of clear plastic of precisely the same type used to bury his victims. Moreover, co-workers at the Houston Lighting and Power Company would also state that, from the earliest days of his employment, Corll had repeatedly retained coils of used nylon cord that would otherwise have been discarded. This brand of cord was the same type used to strangle and bind the bodies of many of his victims. The suspicion is that Corll may have begun killing much earlier than 1970, and may have been abusing youths prior to this date. Moreover, Brooks claims that Corll's first murder victim was a youth killed at an apartment complex on Shootaway Street, where Corll had lived prior to September 1970. The earliest of Corll's victims known by Brooks were 2 teenage boys killed at 3300 Yorktown, where Corll lived after moving out of his Shootaway Street apartment. Corll's earliest double murder, that of James Glass and Danny Yates, took place in December 1970. Glass and Yates were actually killed at Corll's Yorktown address, as was Corll's earliest known murder victim, Jeffrey Allen Conan, killed in September 1970. A possibility exists that the earliest double murder victims were Glass and Yates. However, Brooks specifically described Glass as being killed in an altogether separate double murder from Corll's first double murder in his confession to police. In addition, Brooks only knew the location of Conan's body at High Island Beach due to the fact that Corll had shown him a location. It is possible that the initial double murder Brooks had discovered Corll in the process of committing occurred after the murder of Conan and before those of Glass and Yates. These details, alongside the two additional bones that were found with the 26th and 27th victims discovered, indicate a minimum of 2 and possibly 4 more unknown victims. There are 2 suspiciously long gaps between known victims in the chronology of Corll's known murders. Corll's last known victim of 1971 was Reuben Watson Haney, who disappeared on August 17. The first victim of 1972 was Frank Aguirre, who disappeared on February 24, meaning no known victims were killed for 6 months. Moreover, Corll also is not known to have killed between February 1 and June 4, 1973. Corll's only known unidentified victim, the 16th body found in the boat shed, was in an advanced stage of decomposition at the time of his discovery, leading investigators to deduce that the victim had likely been killed in 1971 or 1972. This unidentified victim was found wearing swimming trunks, cowboy boots, a leather bracelet and a t-shirt, leading investigators to conclude that he was likely killed in the summer months. The body was found buried near the entrance to the boat shed between the bodies of Reuben Haney and Stephen Sickman, whereas the bodies of the victims killed between December 1970 and May 1971 were found buried at the rear of the shed. It is likely, though not conclusive, that the unidentified 16th victim found within the boat shed may have been killed in the late summer or early fall of 1971. Dr. Sharon Derrick has stated that she believes this particular victim may be named Harmon or French, due to the fact that the only outstanding missing persons reports relating to youths from the Houston area dated between 1970 and 1973 which fit the forensic profile of this unknown youth hold these surnames. In addition, the t-shirt this youth had worn bore a handwritten inscription believed to read either LB4MF, LBHMF, or L84MF. Regardless of the date when the unidentified boat shed victim had been killed, there still remains a gap of 4 months between February and June 1973 when no known victims had been claimed by Corll. In March 1973, a Mr. and Mrs. Abernathy had reported to Galveston County authorities that they had observed 3 men carrying and burying a long, wrapped bundle at Galveston Beach. The couple identified 2 of the men as Corll and Henley. The third individual had long, blonde hair, like Brooks. As the couple watched the trio, one of the men, whom they later identified as Henley, advanced upon their car with such a menacing expression that the couple felt compelled to drive away. 2 women had also observed 3 men digging at the beach in May 1973, one of whom they positively identified as Brooks. However, police were again unwilling to extend the search. In February 2012, a picture was released to the news media of a likely unknown victim of Corll. The color Polaroid image had been found in the personal possessions of Henley, which had been stored by his family since his arrest in 1973. The image depicts a blonde-haired teenage youth in handcuffs, strapped to an undepicted device upon Corll's floor, alongside a toolbox known to contain various instruments Corll is known to have used to torture his victims. The individual depicted has been ruled out by the Harris County medical examiner as being any of Corll's known victims, including his one remaining known unidentified victim. Henley himself has stated that the picture must have been taken after he had acquired a Polaroid camera in 1972, although he is adamant that he has no idea who this boy is. Given that Henley became acquainted with Corll in 1972, it is likely this boy would have been killed in 1972 or 1973. Potential association with National Sex Ring. During a routine investigation in March 1975, The Houston police discovered a cache of pornographic pictures and films depicting young boys. Of the 16 individuals depicted within the films and photos, 11 of the youths appeared to be among the 21 victims of Dean Corll who had been identified by this date. The discovery raised a disturbing possibility that the statements Corll had given to both Henley and Brooks prior to his murder, that he was associated with an organization based in Dallas that bought and sold boys, may indeed have held a degree of truth. The discovery of the material in Houston in 1975 subsequently led to the arrest of 5 individuals in Santa Clara, California. No direct link in these arrests to Corll was proven, as Houston police declined to pursue any possible link to the killings, stating they felt Corll's victims' families had suffered enough. There is still no conclusive evidence to suggest that Corll had ever solicited any of his victims in this manner, not only because Houston police chose not to pursue this potential possibility, but also because neither Brooks nor Henley have ever mentioned meeting any individuals from the organization Corll had claimed he was involved with. In addition to these facts, they have never mentioned ever having seen the victims either filmed, photographed or released from Corll's torture board until after their torture and murder. The arrests in Santa Clara do, however, indicate a possible validity into Brooks' statements to police that Corll had informed him that his earliest murder victims had been buried in California. Media. A film loosely inspired by the Houston mass murders, Freak Out, was released in 2003. The film was directed by Brad Jones, who also starred as Dean Corll. This film largely focuses upon the last night of Dean Corll's life, prior to Henley shooting him and contacting authorities. The film has procured mostly mixed to positive reviews, though Jones' performance was acclaimed. Production of a film directly based upon the Houston mass murders, In a Madman's World, finished in 2014. Directed by Josh Vargas, In a Madman's World is directly based upon Elmer Wayne Henley's life before, during, and immediately after his involvement with Dean Corll and David Brooks. Limited edition copies of the film were released in 2017. Bibliography. Christian, Kimberly, 2015. Horror in the Heights: The True Story of the Houston Mass Murders. CreateSpace. ISBN 978-1515190721. Garrell, John K. 1974. Mass Murder in Houston. Cordovan Press. Hanna, David, 1975. Harvest of Horror: Mass Murder in Houston. Belmont Tower. Olson, Jack, 1974. The Man with the Candy: The Story of the Houston Mass Murders. Simon & Schuster. ISBN 978-07432122830. Rosewood, Jack, 2015. Dean Corll: The True Story of the Houston Mass Murders. CreateSpace. ISBN 978-1517-4850009. Television. In 1982 documentary, The Killing of America, features a section devoted to the Houston mass murders. Factual TV hosts a documentary focusing upon the murders committed by Corll and his accomplices. Dr. Sharon Derrick is among those interviewed for the documentary. The Investigation Discovery Channel has broadcast a documentary focusing upon the Houston mass murders within their documentary series, Most Evil. This documentary, entitled Manipulators, features an interview with Elmer Wayne Henley conducted by a former forensic psychologist named Chris Mohandai. The crime thriller series Mindhunter has broadcast an episode featuring the Houston mass murders. This episode was first broadcast on August 16, 2019. See also List of serial killers in the United States. Notes. References. Cited works and further reading: Cawthorn, Nigel, Tibballs, Jeff, 1993. Killers. Boxtree. Pages 408-412. ISBN 0-7522-0850-0.cs1 maint. Refharv, Link. Foreman, Laura, 1992. Serial killers. True crime. Time Life Books. ISBN 978-07835-00010. Francel, Ron, 2010. Crime Buff's Guide to Outlaw Texas. Guilford Press. ISBN 978-0762-75965-1. Garrell, John K. 1974. Mass Murder in Houston. Cordovan, Press. CS1 maint. Ref Harv. Link. Hanna, David, 1975. Harvest of Horror. Mass Murder in Houston. Belmont, Tower. CS1 maint. Ref Harv. Link. Keppel, Robert D. Bernays, William J. 2003. The Psychology of Serial Killer Investigations. The Grizzly Business Unit. Academic Press. p. 8. ISBN 978-012-4042605. Lane, Brian, Greg, Wilfred, 1992. The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers. ISBN 978-0747237310. Olson, Jack, 1974. The Man with the Candy. The Story of the Houston Mass Murders. Simon & Schuster. ISBN 978-0743212830. Vance, Michael, Lomax, John, 2014. Murder and Mayhem in Houston. Historic Bayou City Crime. ISBN 978-1626195219. Wilson, Colin, 2013. A Plague of Murder. The Rise and Rise of Serial Killing in the Modern Age. ISBN 978-1854872494. External links. Case information upon unknown victim, ML73-3356. Corll's only known unidentified victim CrimeLibrary.com article upon Dean Corll. David Brooks' confession specific to the case of William Ray Lawrence. Digging for the Truth. Houston Mass Murders. A website detailing past and present investigations into the Houston mass murders. Elmer Wayne Henley's confession. Facial reconstructions depicting unidentified victim, ML73-3356. Image released in 2012 depicting a likely 30th unidentified victim of Dean Corll. March 1974 Esquire article focusing upon the Houston mass murders. Medical examiner's case report. PA-29-30-31-2, unidentified partial human remains found at High Island August 9, 1973, strongly believed to belong to a Houston mass murders case. The clothing worn by Corll's only known unidentified victim article detailing investigators' suspicions as to the identity of Corll's only unidentified victim, the girl on the torture board. 2014 Houston Press News article focusing upon surviving victims Rhonda Williams and Timothy Curley. The Houston Horrors. Time magazine article. Monday, August 20, 1973. The Houston Mass Murders. What Really Happened? Texas Monthly. April 2011.